All right, if you have your Bibles, turn to Deuteronomy 6. If you got your Bibles, turn to Deuteronomy 6. Mike, thanks so much for that prayer to ask the Lord to illuminate us and with His Word and to bless us with it. I was just very, very blessed by it and very thankful to know that the Lord is a good Father and will do that very thing. So as Christians, we are commanded by God. We are commanded by God to give the next generation of believers a holy education. We've been commanded by God through Moses, commanded by God through Christ. Teach them to obey all that I have commanded. Whether they be children in our homes or new families that join our church that the Father has, pulled from the teeth of the kingdom of darkness. And some of you are those who grew up in Christian homes, and some of you are those who are pulled from the teeth of the kingdom of darkness. And you're sort of first generation in this, but we know from Moses to Christ, God has taught us to teach the next generation of disciples to obey all that He has commanded. That has been His great commission for His people since the beginning. But what does that look like? So we know we've been commanded to do it, but is there instruction on how to do it? What does it look like to give a holy education to the next generation? What does it look like to train them up and to teach them to obey all that the Lord has commanded? Well, we know education is not just book learning. We saw that the word education itself means to lead someone out, is to prepare them for life without you, as Moses was doing in Deuteronomy and as Christ was doing in the Great Commission. So both times that the Lord has given us sort of this great call, it is from people who will soon not be there. How do you educate people? How do you lead them out to continue on when you're not there holding their hand? For the Christian, that means preparing the next generation to live a holy life when you're not making them be holy. As we said, we want to give them a holy education, preparing the whole man to live a holy life. There's not one area of life where we do not want to teach the next generation how to use that area and do that area for the glory of God. We want them to be thinking all of Christ for all of life. And the Bible gives us instructions on how to do that. The Bible doesn't just tell us, give the next generation a holy education. The Bible actually gives us instructions on what that would look like. Yes, we educate them by teaching them everything in this book, but the Bible also gives us specific instructions on what that education will look like. So it's not just going to be where we sit down and just read the book over and over. How does the Bible instruct us in getting these commands into their heads, into their hearts, so that they might fear the Lord? And one of the best places we can find some of these specific instructions on education itself, on this holy education, in one singular passage. So, we've just been digging in Deuteronomy 6. You could write a whole book of education on Deuteronomy 6. And every time I wrote that line and looked at that line, I went, well, why don't you? You could write a whole book on education just from Deuteronomy 6 on what a holy Christian education would look like. And that's what we're doing. We're just going to Deuteronomy 6 and saying, the Lord tells us this is a command, teach them these things. But then He gives a lot of instruction in how to do that. A lot of ways to narrow our focus. So it's not just wide open sort of teach them, we'll do whatever you want. He kind of tells us how to do that. So let's stand as we read the Word of our God. We who've asked Him to bless us by taking this Word and not just putting it on the page, but putting it in our hearts. Let's see what God would speak to us today. And then let's pray that we would be obedient to it. In Deuteronomy 6, beginning in verse 1, now this is the commandment, the statutes and the rules, that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over, to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son and your son's son, by keeping all His statutes and His commandments, which I commanded you all the days of your life, and that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. All right, you may be seated. So we've moved through Deuteronomy 6, sort of line by line, section by section, verse by verse, to sort of glean principles along the way, to look at a verse and see. So God commands us this holy education that's going to be picked back up really throughout the Old Testament into the New Testament as well, repeated on the lips of Christ, this sort of great commissioning that He gives us. So what principles do we see here? And as we've moved just line by line through Deuteronomy 6, we've seen a whole list of things, all taken from this section where Moses is telling the people about God's command to him to teach them to then teach the next generation. And so as he's said, I've got to command you to teach the next generation. This is, I'm going to command you to do that and then tell you how to do that. What have we seen so far? What have we seen in terms of a holy education? An education that is holy, the whole of man living a holy life. Well, the first thing we saw was that a holy education seeks obedience, not just knowledge. So we saw that. We learned so that we might obey what we've been taught. We saw a holy education is built to conquer. We train the next generation not just to survive, but to destroy the arguments of this world. We assure them of victory, that the gates of hell will not prevail, that we're sharpening arrows, not blunting shields. We saw that a holy education has the goal of the fear of the Lord. Moses says he's aiming for two things, that they might fear the Lord, and we saw how important that is. What you're aiming for will affect the means you use to get there. And education, what is its goal? It's not just to make the next generation intelligent. Our main goal is for them to fear the Lord, to be amazed by His glory and holiness, and have faith in Him because they're amazed by His glory and holiness. We saw that a holy education is a faith-based education, not faith in materials or in methods. Not saying, well, if you do this right, it'll work, or if you do the right materials, it'll work. But faith in the promises of God. Trusting as whatever you do, that you know the promises of God are what you're having faith in. And holy education thinks generationally. We don't just teach this next generation to know it. We teach them to know it well enough that they might teach it. That's what Moses is doing here. I'm teaching you so that you might teach your sons and your sons' sons. And the same thing happens when we're teaching. A holy education teaches so that they might teach, and that's a different standard, and then it will result in a different way that we do it. A holy education is the path to a blessed life. We saw that he sought two things. He said, I want you to fear the Lord, and he said, so that you might fear the Lord, and so that what? So that you might have your days be long. So he says two things. Then he drops into verse 3 and says, hear therefore, Israel, and starts saying, if you want this good life, if you want to be multiplied, if you want this land flowing with milk and honey, you need to listen to these things. So the Lord, a holy education promises a blessed life. A long life and a good life comes from this, and encourages the next generation with those promises as well. A holy education begins with preparing your own heart. So we saw last week that the way you begin, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And then you shall teach it. We often read that and assume, yeah, I love it. So what do I need to do? I need to teach it, I need to do this, and I need to do that. And we forget to focus on the first step in establishing a holy education is your heart. You have to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. It's the most important teaching tool you will have, the most effective teaching tool, the one you've got to get down as you wade through all the various options of how to teach and who to teach. The one thing you've got to have, the most important tool, is your own love for the Lord. And then lastly, we saw a holy education is biblically saturated, that from root to fruit, the Bible is the source and substance of everything. It's the why we do it. It's the how we do it. It's the what we're looking for. All of that is defined by the Bible. And if we're not careful, we might have the Bible in one area and then let Egypt define the others. And we've got to make sure the Bible, or maybe even just ourselves, we've got to make sure the Bible is defining every step of the way, that it is saturating every part of education. So that gets us down to around verse 7, right? So all of that just to get us down to around verse 7. What else can we learn from this passage about principles for teaching the next generation of believers? And this will be our last one. Then we'll have our Easter service next week. So this is the last one on a holy education. But if a church is going to prepare the next generation of believers, either in their homes or as the Lord brings Gentiles into their midst, what sort of education must it give and how must it give it? The next thing we see is a holy education is one of localized obedience. One of localized obedience. Look at verse 7. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall write them on the doorpost, or you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. The Israelites were required to teach their children. Now, this is not advocating for some form of Jewish government school here. It's not you make sure that someone teaches your kids. No, this is directed toward the individual parent of these children. This is a family level command. You shall teach your children. You teach these things diligently to your children. And we see this in the locality of the education. That's why I said this is localized obedience. So you do, but look at the locality, the local nature of this education. Where is it done? In your house. When you are walking with them, when you lie down, when you rise up, you teach your kids in your home. That's the primary means that God has given for the fear of the Lord to be passed to the next generation. Now that doesn't mean that this is how everyone is taught. Like we said, there are going to be Gentile converts that the Lord is going to bring even into Israel. But what's happened is the modern church, what it's done is almost eschew this natural mode of education and focuses everything on the anomalies. In other words, instead of realizing that the Bible expects Christian kids to be taught about the Bible in their homes, all education in the church becomes focused on those outside. The people say, well, what about people who don't come from Christian homes? What about people who come from outside the faith? What about lost people? How are we going to educate them? Or when they come, and it ends up having, even our worship services end up being brought into these anomalies. And these commands and instructions from the Lord end up barely even being mentioned to Christians, much less drilled into our minds. And I think that explains a lot for the state of the church today. And the reason so many Christian children or children from Christian families end up struggling is because the church has focused so little on the importance of parents teaching these things to their own children, and instead focused on those who are not their children and making sure that they get the gospel. And I've seen homes upon homes of families who have focused their whole education, their whole lives on teaching people who were not their kids. And their kids have struggled for it. But notice here that it is every parent among the 1 million some odd Israelites that God's called here. You teach your children and you teach them in your house. Not some of the Israelites teach all the children. Not that you can't do it. There's some really good at teaching and they're called to teach all the children. But rather you teach your children. Now, I think that seeing this as a command to homeschool, right? I think that, as some people do, which isn't crazy, but I don't think that's necessarily what it's saying here. I think it might be going too far. But it is certainly saying that no parent can pawn off the education of their children to others. You cannot pawn it off to others. You are still responsible to educate them. Not responsible to make sure other people educate them. You are responsible for their education. If you want to have a formalized education somewhere else, then that must come as a supplement, not a replacement for what happens in the home. And this coming from a guy who started a Christian school, right? Because this is a command to you. This is a command to every one of the Israelites here. And that means every Israelite, he speaks to and he says to every Israelite, this is what you do. And that means that your house must still be a hub for the primary location of their learning about the fear of the Lord. You know, you may not do homeschool, but you cannot choose to do no school. There has to be some way that you're obeying this command with your children. Again, you might supplement their education with something else, but you cannot abdicate their education to anyone else. This most important of verses here that God's giving to the people cannot be a meaningless verse because of where we are and when we live. And because we live in a country that has established a certain education style or whatever, this cannot be a meaningless verse now to us. It has to mean something. And it has to mean what it says. And notice, it's not just making sure that your children are educated, it's making sure that you educate them. You shall teach them to your children. The command is not about getting these things in your kids' heads the best way possible. The command is to get them on your lips and keep them there. And those commands are still true, even if you add to that, again, a formalized education at a godly institution somewhere. Even if you do that. Because the command here isn't a command to just figure out how to get these things in your kids' heads the best way. And you go, well, I can't get them in my kids' heads the best way. These people can, or this place can, or Chris can, or someone else can, or this type of minister can, or that type of minister can. Not me. The command was for you to talk about these things all over your house all day long. And that's still the command for you. You talk about these things of God all over your house all day long. And no one else can do that for you. No one else can do that most primary of education for you. Your job, teach these things by having them on your lips in front. So put them in front of your eyes, write them on your hands so that you don't forget to do this. You put them on your house, you put them on your gates, you do whatever. But every bit of your day, you make sure that you're teaching them these things to your children by talking about them all the time. There is in the Christian home a general feeling of I can't do this when it comes to educating our children. I hear this sometimes, this sort of fear of failure because they don't feel prepared to teach, because the school they went from certainly didn't, the school they grew up in didn't teach them. They just learned for a test. They didn't really learn anything, or they're seeing schools sort of spiraling education-wise, and they're wanting to know what to do, and so I don't think I can do this. I don't think I'm prepared. And what I want us to do is I want us to notice, if you ever think, okay, I'm commanded to teach, I know these people are commanded, the Bible commands all of these Israelites to teach their children, but I can't do that. I'm not prepared. I'm not ready. I couldn't do that. And again, I'm not talking about the preparation of loving the Lord your God with heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's the only preparation you need. If you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, you can do this to your children. Now, how do you know that? I'm not prepared. I don't know these. I've got to have time to learn this. Look at the context of what we're talking about. Look at what's going on in this verse. Think of how vast and how unprepared the generation was that Moses is talking to. I mean, they're being told, be ready to teach, and they haven't even heard what they're supposed to teach yet. Because Moses is going to say, be ready to teach these commands that I teach you today. You be ready to teach. You shall teach them to your children. These commands that I teach you today, you shall teach them to your children. I mean, we fret about, I'm not sure if I know the subject well enough. Well, they hadn't even heard the subject yet. And they were already being commanded to teach. They didn't even know what they were going to teach yet, but they knew they had to. They knew they were being told to. And God was telling them to be ready to teach it. And so when people come to me and say, can I do this? My answer is always yes. And that's if you've just learned that subject today. That's if you just learn about it this day. If you learn about it 30 minutes before you have to teach it or talk about it, you're good. You're at least in line with Deuteronomy 6. Well, I don't know about this, or I don't know about that, or I don't know about whatever. Well, learn it. Learn it. And again, if you learn it more than that day, you're ahead of the Israelites here. Here Moses tells these parents, yes, you can educate the next generation, and you must. When it comes to the education of your children, or the education of the next generation of believers, you are commanded to teach them and to teach them locally. You don't just teach them, it says you teach them in your house. You teach them when you fill your home with a holy education. And you think about that. If you supplement a holy education and you supplement it from a godly institution like the Foundry or some other Christian private school, and yet your kids come home and this stuff is never on your lips, you never talk about it, you are going to undo all that you just spent time trying to get done and all the stuff that you probably paid to get done, paid to have others do to supplement that. You're going to cut the roots right out from underneath it if you yourself are not filling the home by you talking about the Lord. When you get up, when you in other words, when you rise, it shouldn't just be, hey, I'm waking up so I can get my kids ready to go be taught by someone else. Wake up, guys. You've got to hurry up and be taught the Bible. When you wake up, the Lord should be on your lips. When you go to sleep, the Lord should be on your lips. And you can't just say, well, I'm pretty sure the Lord was on other people's lips throughout the day for them, so it doesn't have to be on mine. You can't do that. You have an obligation in your house to talk about the Lord, to teach your children the commands of the Lord all day long. You want to supplement that with something else? That's fine, but you cannot replace it. You cannot replace it. You can supplement it. You can add to it, but nothing and no one can replace you in your home. Your mouth in your home to your children, that's the primary means of a holy education. Everything else might add to that, but it can never replace it. And we've seen the results of when we try and replace the home with something else, and none of the results have been good. The next thing is a holy education is a seed education. A holy education is a seed education. It is a seminary education. It is a seminary education. I say that. The word seminary, when I say the word seminary, we often think of like a Christian school somewhere. But the word seminary just comes from the word seed. It comes from the word seed, which is what seminaries were supposed to do. They were seed places for ministers to learn. They were seed beds. They were seminaries. They were places where the seed of what they learned could then grow throughout the lives of people. We've turned seminaries into where they learn everything. You got to learn everything. And then you go, now these are just supposed to be places that you get the seeds of what you're supposed to learn. Just give them a seed of education that's supposed to grow throughout the life of the minister. Well, you can give and must give a seminary education in your home. Meaning you must understand that what you're doing is planting seeds. You are planting seeds. What you're doing, in other words, will take time to mature. And the various seeds that you plant in the various soils in which they are planted may cause these seeds to rise up in different ways and at different times. And what happens is we can plant a seed and be frustrated that that seed didn't immediately go, and sprout as quickly because we had another seed. It was a really good and quick growing seed, and we've got this, and we begin to question. Look, you need to understand that your job is just to plant the seeds. And that everything you do is going to take that time to mature. And every generation needs to both harvest and plant anew. Right? Every generation is both going to harvest and plant new seeds. And we see this. Go down to verse 20. We see this when he says, when your son asks you in time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord your God has commanded you. You teach, and he says, there will come a time after you have taught them all these things that your son finally comes up and goes, why are we doing this? And that's probably the time where you go, I'm a failure. What do you mean, why are we doing this? You don't know why we're doing this? But when your son comes up and says, why are you teaching us these things? Why do we do this? And how do you think seminarily in that? How do you get a seminary education in your home? How do you get this seed education? One thing you do is you think progressively. Part of the frustration as parents and as churches, as we try to figure out what to do, is we try to figure out the perfect way to do everything. And until we figured out the perfect, we end up doing nothing, right? But that's not really your goal. Your goal isn't to figure out the perfect. Your goal is simply to build onto the generation before you. And to encourage your kids to build on top of what you're doing. Your job is just to do better than was done. And to do better than was done, not because you're better than who taught you, but because you're standing on the shoulders of who taught you. And your kids will stand on your shoulders. And the next generation of Christians that come in here will stand on your shoulders. And you may say, well, I didn't grow up in a Christian home, and I struggled for a long time, and it was really hard. So when the next generation of Christian comes, they don't have to struggle because they're standing up on the struggles of one who struggled before them. They're able to learn from you. They're able to get your wisdom. You don't sit and watch them go through the same things. I had to learn the same thing. Sink or swim, buddy. You teach them the maturity that you learned through experience. So go into the whole thing knowing that when you're educating the next generation and you're teaching your kids and you're talking about in the home and you know, family worship or whatever isn't always perfect all the time, or you forgot to talk about it when you went to bed one time, and you feel like you're saying things that's not coming out right, and you feel like you're not doing well, and you see someone else that's doing it better, and you go, oh, I wish I could have done that, and then but they're already growing up too much, and what do I do now? Listen, you understand you are building an imperfect product in imperfect ways. There is a problem when it comes to holy education, which is paralysis by perfection. Where we don't do anything until we know how to do it perfectly. I call it perfectionation, which is procrastination by perfectionism. We end up procrastinating because we can't figure out the perfect, and in the end we haven't done anything. In an effort to do everything the best, we end up doing nothing at all. You're not going to do it all perfectly. And there are things that I look back at and I go, oh, poor firstborns. You know, just poor firstborns. And we've all seen the difference between Avery and Aubrey, right? The firstborn and then the one who came later. And just the difference in the growth and the, you know. So, I mean, those things, I am a better teacher of my children. I will teach Beatrix better than I taught Gideon. And Gideon said, amen. I should. But what I can't do is look back and spend my whole time lamenting at what was imperfect in the teaching of the first generation, or for it to be Beatrix here now, and Gideon 17, and I go, I got it, let's go. Now I've figured it out. Gideon, are you ready? He's like, 2 + 2 = what? That's not what we want to do. You want to procrastinate to the point that you don't do anything. Because you're going, that's not perfect. It's not perfect. And I see all these other people who are doing it perfectly. Your job's not to do it perfect. Your job is to plant the seed. And to realize that what you're doing is going to mature. And it might not mature. You might not even get to see it mature, as is in the case with Moses, right? You might even get to see the maturity. So you're not going to do it all perfect. And you'll learn things. And you'll wish you'd done things different in your home with your kids. And that's okay. It's natural. It's expected. It's part of your own sanctification, your own holification, is to realize that if I had been holier here, 15 years ago, then I would have done things differently. So don't try and build the perfect model, but build something that can be built upon. Build something that can be built upon. Make sure that in the same way, your kids don't just repeat what you've done, but that you and they are thinking about how to build onto it. Start an edifice that will be built brick by a generation that's going to follow you. Build vineyards for them to reap from. Let them inherit your vineyard of knowledge and experience, so they don't have to figure it out themselves. You're not trying to build the perfect vineyard. You're just trying to grow the vineyard. I love what Psalm 78 says about trusting our children to be better than us. Psalm 78 says, "Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things we have heard and known that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell them to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and His might and the wonders that He has done. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children, so they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments. They should not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to the Lord." Expect the generation after you to build on to what you've done. How do you eat an elephant? You eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? How do you conquer the world? One generation at a time. Plant seeds that will grow and mature and drop their own seeds. And do that on and on for 1,000 generations. You're not building the perfect vineyard, but you're building a vineyard that your children can harvest from and plant seeds from that harvest to make an even greater vineyard to come. And lastly, a holy education is joyously redeemed. Let's continue on in verse 20, down at the bottom of Deuteronomy 6. Look at what it says. "When your son asks you this, what's the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord our God has commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed us signs and wonders great and grievous against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his household before our eyes. And He brought us out from there that He might bring us in and give us this land that He swore to give to our fathers." Notice the family aspect. He did this for us, not He just did this for me. Now realize He's talking to a generation that were children when the Exodus occurred. And He says, your children are going to come and ask you this, and you're going to tell them, we were slaves. We were slaves. Those kids weren't. He said, we were. And the Lord's redemption of you as a people is the meaning for why we don't do what we do. We plant this vineyard. Why do we plant this particular vineyard, Father? He says, because we were slaves. And look at the joy in it. Look at the joy. So we were redeemed as slaves. We were slaves, but we've been redeemed by the mighty hand of the Lord, and we are joyous in that. So we teach them as slaves who've been redeemed, but slaves who've been joyously redeemed. Go down to verse 24. "And the Lord commanded," so why do we do this? We were slaves, and the Lord brought us out, and the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God, for our good always. So fear the Lord and for our good, which we saw were the two things that He said. You do this so you can fear the Lord and so you have a good long life. Fear the Lord our God for our good always, that He might preserve us alive as we are this day. And it will be righteousness for us if we are careful to do all this commandment before the Lord our God as He commanded us. These commandments, these laws, these statutes, these truths given to us because God has made us His children by redeeming us. This education you teach your children is not a burden, it is a blessing. It is not a duty, it's a delight. It is I would say it's not a prescript, it's a promise, but it is both a prescript and a promise. Do this and you will live. A conquering education, a holy education, doesn't ham-fist in the gospel somewhere. It doesn't teach everything else and then Jesus juke on a couple of subjects and just put the Bible in here and there, put the gospel in here and there. A holy education wallows in the gospel. It is, like we said, biblically saturated. Because it's biblically saturated, it is inundated with the gospel. The gospel seeps through every page and in every lesson and in every instruction. It is the gospel. It is the fact that we've been joyously redeemed that is the purpose and principle and practice of everything that we do. What is the purpose? Why do we do this? Because we've been joyously redeemed. What is the principle? How do we do this? Because we've been joyously redeemed. What is our practice? What are we looking for? The gospel, because we've been joyously redeemed. So what can we do with this as he finishes up that talk on education? We want to finish it up here. Just a couple of uses and we'll be done. And we can go and fellowship together and talk about his word and encourage one another. And every time we sit in our chairs at lunch, we'll talk about the Lord. And when we stand up at lunch, we'll talk about the Lord. And a couple of uses. One, you must teach your children, and you can teach your children. You must teach your children the commands of the Lord, and you can teach them. Do it. So this is the localized obedience. Do it. Obey. The Lord tells you to do it. The Lord tells all of Israel here, this is what you do. You teach your children these things. Do it, but do it confidently as well. God is commanding you to do what he is also equipping you to do. He doesn't say, teach them, and I hope you figure it out. He says, teach them what I'm about to tell you. Teach them all. Well, what is it? What do I teach them? Teach them what I'm going to tell you. Just teach it to them and teach them to do it. Do it, be obedient, but be confident. He doesn't just say, teach them about me. He says, here's the curriculum. You be faithful to it. And I'll be faithful to you, and I'll be faithful to your children, and I'll be faithful to your children's children. Just be faithful. Here's what I want you to teach them, and do it. So we must teach our children, and we can teach our children. So we must do that. We can supplement the education of our children, but we can never replace it. We can never replace it. You are the one commanded to teach your children in your homes. If you have children, you're commanded to teach them. If you have a home, that's where you're commanded to teach them. The next thing, the home is supposed to be the hub of Christian education, not the church. I think this is a good thing for us to learn. The Christian home and the Christian parent must recapture itself as the central means given by God for the education of the next generation of believers, and the church must help them do that. And I don't think the modern church has helped Christian families do that. In fact, I think the modern church has hindered Christian families from thinking they should and even can do this very thing. I think if you, government education was an attack on the family structure. Education is something that the government has planned out for you. Your job is just sort of to put your children on that government-supplied conveyor belt, and don't worry, we'll take care of the rest. And we're going to do this so you can go to work, Dad, and you can go to work, Mom, and no one's even going to be home to watch them. And so we'll take care of it, and we'll teach them a bunch of good stuff. And instead of the Christian world going, no, I don't think so. That command was, given to me. I'm supposed to teach them in my home. Instead of the Christian world saying, nope, we're not doing that, the church ended up copying it and having their own forms of that, of specialized education. We must reassert the home and the parents' job of teaching their children to know and do the commands of God. The battle for the home is indeed the battle for the cosmos. The world knows that. The enemy knows that. And the church has somehow forgotten what it was taught. And so the home should be the primary means for the education of your children. The home should be the primary means of education for new converts. Meaning this, oftentimes when we share the gospel with people, all we think is, oh, I better get them to church. And the idea is that we get them to church because that's where they're going to learn, and that's where they're going to get these things. Don't get them to church. Get them in your house. Get them in your house and let them see you talk about the Lord. When you rise, when you sit, let them see that they're entering a new kingdom when they pass through your doorposts. Let them feel it when they walk in between your gates. This is a different world that I am entering. Your house, your place, your words, your life. Get them to the church for worship, sure, but get them into your home for education. Well, can I do that? Can I do that? Do we just get them into the pastor's homes? Do we just get who's going to, I can't teach somebody these things. Well, you can. If you love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, all you do is teach them to obey what the Word says. You don't have to teach them some sort of complex biblical calculus. If that's what pastors do when they educate new converts, pastors need to do something else. You just teach them to obey what you yourself are obeying. Can you do this? Well, you're the one that God has put in their life. You're the one that God has made their neighbor. You're the one that God has made their co-worker. And not just so you can be a middleman to hurry up and get them to the church building or to get them to a pastor. You're the one God has put in their life. You and your home. You're essentially their Christian parent. Don't bring them to church hoping they either become the biblical equivalent of wards of the state, or that they become adopted by someone else. I'm going to get them to church, and the church will take their education. That's the biblical version of wards of the state. I'll get them to church, and I bet so-and-so will start teaching them. That's the Christian version of hoping they get adopted. No, you are the one God has put into their life. Open your home. Open your home, and you'll see how quickly God equips you to teach even something that you learned just that day. But the home has always been the centralized hub for Christian education. You think about it, people didn't go to the tabernacle and the temple to learn these new things. This happened in their homes, and we need to get that back. The world doesn't want that. The world wants the home to be abdicated and empty because it is so powerful for the kingdom of God. The Christian world must recapture the home as the hub of Christian education. Otherwise, we retard any attempts to educate our children or the next generation. It might happen, but it's not going to happen as God designed it to happen. The next thing, we've got to start playing the long game, and these last uses will be fairly quick. We've got to start playing the long game. Christian education is not about a quick fix, but about generational plotting. And so when you're looking at what you're wanting to do, don't just think about the here and now and the immediate. Think faithful lesson after faithful lesson. You are progressing what your home is and what the next generation will be. The better you are by the time you get done educating these kids, the better off they'll start when they educate the next generation. So don't think you've got to get it perfect. Just be doing better and better, and know that your children are going to do better than you, because they're not going to get started where you got started. They're going to get started where you led them out, where you educated them. So where your children are going to do better than you, and their children better than them, until the garden you planted becomes part of a kingdom of gardens that God has sprouted across creation. And last, you must educate with redeemed joy. You must educate your children, and it must be with redeemed joy. All of this, the what's, the how's, the goals, the methods, they all come from this simple reality. God has saved us, and we, out of joy in that salvation and joy in the God who saved, want to love Him and want to teach Him to our children. That's why we do what we do. Education, a holy education, Christian, is just setting our eyes, and then the next generation's eyes, on the incomparable glory of Christ, and resetting those eyes day after day, resetting our own eyes and resetting their eyes on Christ day after day, sharpening and sharpening with the Word of God, and doing this moment by moment for a lifetime. Every time you sit, every time you rise, when you walk, when you lie down, sharpening, sharpening, sharpening. Eyes on Christ, eyes on Christ, eyes on Christ, with a smile on your lips, knowing that in the end, the light of the gospel is what will help our children fly straight and true with an education that doesn't just survive, it conquers. Let's pray. Let's take a moment to ask these things of the Lord. Ask the Lord that you would be obedient to teach your children. The Lord has commanded you to teach your children. Ask that you would be obedient to do that. Lord, help me be obedient to teach my children in my home. That your home would be a place where you're modeling the thing that you're telling them to do. Teach them to obey. Well, here's how you can obey in teaching them to obey. Teach your children in your home. That's the primary place of education. That's where they get to see you in real life. Not in a role, not in a particular job or aspect. This is how you live. This is what we fill our home with. The Lord, the Lord, the Lord, and His commands, and we do them. Supplement all you want, but do not replace it with anything else. Don't replace it with a pastor. Don't replace it with the foundry. Don't replace it with anything. You teach your children in your home. Next, pray that the church would recapture the home as that hub of Christian education for our children, for the next generation. That we would see our homes as outposts of the kingdom. That we don't just want to get people to church and run them through the rigmarole or the liturgy here or whatever. We want to educate them and then gather together to worship. But the primary means of education has always been the home. For people to see the gospel lived out in real life. So pray that the church would recapture that. The church has abdicated that a lot. And the church building has become the place of Christian education. And then parents are no longer the main educators. They're specialized educators that teach the children or whomever. You in your home, there is nothing more powerful. Ask that God would help you play the long game. Ask that you would see that this is not about an immediate fight, but that you know you're building and the next generation is going to grow on that. The next generation is going to do better than you. Ask that God would help you to see that. It can be so easy to become anxious and frustrated because we're so myopic. We just look at the here and now instead of trusting. Like Moses had to do, is he trusts and then knows, I'm going to die. I'm not even going to see this stuff. But I trust that the Lord's going to teach you and your sons and your sons' sons. No, He's never going to see their sons' sons. But it's a generational plotting and a generational trust in the Lord. Lord, bring that seed to fruit. My faith is in you. And if your faith's in the Lord, then you don't get anxious. And you don't get frustrated. And you don't wonder, where did I fail? Or what did I do wrong? And you see what you've built on. You see where you've pointed them, and you trust the Lord to be faithful to His word. Even when sometimes it seems really hard to trust. The Lord will be faithful. Trust Him. And then when you are educating in your home, do it with redeemed joy. Just joyously. Not like it's having to be pulled from us. Not like it's something we've just got to do. Not that type of prescription where you've just got to, grit your teeth and swallow it. But a prescription with a promise that brings praise. You've been redeemed, and you can't help but talk about the Lord. You can't help but when you sit down to talk about the Lord and His commands and to be obedient to them and talk about how you've been obeying them and the blessed life that's come from it, how could we not talk about those things? Tell your children how you were once slaves in Egypt, and tell them how instead now you have a life filled with milk and honey because the Lord has been faithful. He didn't just redeem you. He filled you with joy. Ask the Lord to help you do that. Father, Father in heaven, we come to you this morning, God. You've laid out for us a lot, and because it's so important about how to teach this next generation, Father. Whether they are in our homes or whether like moths to the flame, they are attracted to our city on a hill, however it may be, Father, you have told us how to teach them. And you have told us that our obedience to you will be what teaches them the most. Whether it is our own children or whether it is the Gentile nations that you told Israel, they will see your obedience and want to know about your God. So, Father, help us to live the lives that we're supposed to live. Help us to talk about you in our homes, to live out in our homes what we've seen and heard, what we've read, what you have said. Help us, Father. Help us in this battle for the home. Help us to trust you. Help us to be obedient to you. And help us to fill our homes with your word and with obedience to it. Oh, what joy that we can add so much to that in so many different ways. You have blessed so many ways for us to implement and do that, but we never want to abdicate that, Father. We never want to pawn that off to somebody else alone. The responsibility is ours. So as men, may we lead that charge. May we not abdicate that to our wives and say, oh, I got to, you teach your home, and then look at our wives and say, honey, you got that? May we see our responsibility. May we lead out in championing this in the home. May it be ever on our lips, and may we not come home and just, fall onto the couch because we've been working so hard and I ain't got time to talk to nobody. I'm just tired. I just got to go to bed. I can't talk about Jesus. It takes too much. May it be something that is nonstop on our lips. That when we walk through those gates, we know whose name is going to be on our lips. And that our joyously redeemed talks may be heard by our children and seen by our children and by all that you call to your kingdom. Please, Father, help us to do these things. Help us to trust where it looks like and we wish that things had been done better, and where we're waiting for fruit to sprout and we're looking at it and we're going, it's been a long time. I wish the fruit was greater and I want more from it. Help us to trust you, Father. Help us to trust that the harvest will come and that you will always be faithful, generation after generation. And that faithfulness may come with seeds that sprout when we are long gone. But help us, Father, to trust in you, that the next generation might build on our shoulders, Father, that we might not see ourselves as the pinnacle, but as maybe the first or second row of bricks, and that you are building into a holy edifice for your glory. It is in the name of Christ that we joyously ask this. Amen.